Clara Whitcomb pressed her back against the garden wall and read that letter one final time. The one she'd never send, the one that said, "I love you," to a man who didn't know she existed. Upstairs, her mother was already laying out the dress she'd wear to meet Samuel Whitmore. Downstairs, her father was pouring brandy for a man who'd ruined 3 women before her. And somewhere across this city, Nathaniel Ashford was riding toward a party he hadn't wanted to attend, and a girl he wasn't supposed to save. If you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please hit that button now and follow this story all the way to the end. Then drop your city in the comments below because I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Boston, Massachusetts, June 1818. The Hargrove Summer Ball was the kind of evening that looked like a painting and smelled like ambition. Every family of standing in the city had accepted the invitation. Every mother had pressed her daughter's gowns the night before. Every father had reviewed once more which names carried money and which names merely carried reputation. James Whitcomb had reviewed both lists and decided Samuel Whitmore sat comfortably at the top of each. Clara knew this because her father had told her so, not once, not twice, but 4 separate times between supper and the moment their carriage rolled to a stop in front of the Hargrove estate. He'd said it the way men said things they believed were settled. He'd said it with that particular steadiness in his jaw that meant, "This is not a conversation, Clara, this is a conclusion." She hadn't argued. She'd learned by 19 that arguing with James Whitcomb before a social engagement produced nothing but a headache and a tighter grip on her arm at the door. So she sat straight. She folded her hands. She watched the torchlight flicker through the carriage window, and she thought about the letter she'd burned that morning, the one she'd written at 2 in the morning, the one no one would ever read, the one that had started with "Dear Mr. Ashford" and ended with something far more honest than she'd intended. She didn't think about Nathaniel Ashford. She told herself that firmly. She thought about the evening ahead. She thought about Samuel Whitmore's wide smile and easy manners and the way her mother lit up whenever his name crossed a conversation. She thought about duty. She thought about family. She thought about being sensible. She did not think about Nathaniel Ashford. "You'll be pleasant," her mother Margaret said, adjusting the ribbon at Clara's collar. "Gracious, attentive. Mr. Whitmore is bringing his mother tonight. First impressions." "I understand, Mama." "Clara." Margaret's voice dropped just a fraction, not unkind, tired. "You have a habit of looking as though you're tolerating the room rather than enjoying it. Tonight, enjoy it." "Yes, ma'am." The Hargrove ballroom was warm with candlelight and the particular noise of 200 people performing happiness at one another. Clara moved through it the way she always moved through such rooms, with careful attention and very little display. She smiled at the right moments. She accepted a glass of punch she had no intention of drinking. She listened to Lydia Hawthorne describe in elaborate detail the new draperies at the Bellamy house, and she nodded as though this information mattered to her personally. Samuel Whitmore found her within 20 minutes. He always did. "Miss Whitcomb." He bowed with that particular flourish he'd cultivated, not quite theatrical, just enough to suggest he found himself charming. "You look extraordinarily well this evening." "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore." She curtsied. "How do you find the evening?" "Improved considerably." He said it like a man who expected the compliment to land. It did not on Clara, but on her mother, who beamed from 3 feet away. "I was hoping you might save me the next dance. I've been looking forward to it since Thursday, if I'm being candid." "You're always candid, Mr. Whitmore," Clara said. He laughed at that, a full, generous laugh that drew eyes from across the room. That was Samuel Whitmore's particular gift. He laughed loudly enough that other people felt included. He was handsome, Clara knew. Broad-shouldered, quick-tongued, with dark eyes that held warmth so readily, it was almost impossible to question whether that warmth was real. Clara questioned it. She hadn't always. There had been a season, not this one, the one before, when she'd believed in that warmth the way her mother wanted her to. She'd thought his attentiveness was genuine care. She'd thought his stories were charming rather than calculated. She'd thought the gap between what he said and what she felt in the room around him was simply her own nervousness, her own tendency to read shadows into sunlight. Then she'd seen him in October at the Henderson dinner. She'd come down the back staircase and stopped at the bottom when she heard his voice through the half-open parlor door. He'd been talking to Frederick Lyle, the sort of conversation men believed women couldn't follow, the sort where the real arithmetic of ambition got spoken plainly. The Whitcomb girl is the sensible play, he'd said. Fathers in shipping, no sons. Where else does the money go? She'd stood very still on that bottom stair for a long moment. Then she'd gone back up, changed her gloves, and come down the front staircase instead. She hadn't told her parents. She'd written a letter at 2 in the morning instead, not to Whitmore, not to her father. To no one, really. To herself. And somewhere in the middle of it, without quite meaning to, she'd written Nathaniel Ashford's name. Now Whitmore was offering her his hand for the dance, and her mother was watching, and her father was across the room with the expression he wore when he expected things to proceed correctly. Clara took the offered hand. It was during the second figure of the dance that she saw him. Nathaniel Ashford stood near the far wall with a glass he wasn't drinking and a conversation he wasn't having. He was the sort of man who made stillness look purposeful. No fidgeting, no scanning of the room for better prospects, no performance of ease. He simply stood. He was perhaps 30, lean and dark-haired, with the kind of face that recorded things rather than displayed them. She had met him exactly 4 times. She remembered each occasion with an exactness she found embarrassing. She did not look at him again. She smiled at Whitmore. She completed the figure. After the dance, Whitmore guided her toward the far corner of the room, with a hand barely touching the small of her back, just present enough to establish direction, just light enough to preserve the appearance of a gentleman. Clara recognized the maneuver. "I was hoping," he said, lowering his voice to something intimate, "to speak with your father this evening, about something particular. I believe he expects it." Clara kept her expression pleasant. "I'm sure whatever you have to discuss, he'll welcome the conversation." "And you, Miss Whitcomb?" Whitmore's smile deepened. "Would you welcome it?" "That depends entirely on the subject, Mr. Whitmore." He laughed again. It was the kind of answer he found delightful because he chose to interpret it as coquetry. Clara was not being coquettish. She excused herself on the pretext of finding her mother and moved toward the open side door, stepping out into the slightly cooler air of the side corridor. She needed 3 minutes. She required simply 3 minutes to stand somewhere quiet and remind herself that she was a sensible woman, and sensible women did not build their lives around letters they burned, or men who had never looked at them with anything more than basic courtesy. "Miss Whitcomb." The voice came from her left. She turned. Nathaniel Ashford stood at the end of the corridor, holding his glass, still watching her with that recording expression she'd catalogued across 4 meetings. He didn't move toward her immediately. He waited, which was, she'd come to understand simply how he operated. He waited to see if the other person wanted the conversation. She didn't flee. "Mr. Ashford?" "I didn't intend to interrupt," he said. "You didn't." He seemed to consider this. Then, without preamble, without the social scaffolding that would have preceded such a statement from any other man in that building, he said, "You came out here to avoid Whitmore." The directness of it nearly startled her into honesty. "I came out here for air." "Yes, ma'am." A pause. It wasn't dismissive. It was more like he was letting the polite answer rest in the space between them without making her feel foolish for it. "He's been working this room since he arrived. The Henderson girl, the Bellamy girl, you." He said it without accusation, simply as observation. "I don't know your circumstances, but I'd reckon you already have your own opinions about him." Clara looked at him steadily. "What makes you say that?" "Because you've smiled at everything he said tonight without your eyes moving." The corridor was quiet. Somewhere behind the closed door, the music had resumed a reel, bright and insistent. Clara was aware of her own pulse in a way she found inconvenient. "You've been watching me, Mr. Ashford," she said. She meant it as a reproach. It didn't come out that way. "I've been watching him," Nathaniel said. "You happen to be in the same line of sight." He set his glass down on the hall table beside him and squared toward her, not encroaching, just making the conversation something they were both fully present in. I know things about Whitmore that your family likely doesn't. Not rumor. Documented fact. Such as gambling debts in Philadelphia. 3 of them all quietly settled by other men's money. A broken engagement in Richmond the family paid to keep it quiet. The manner in which he speaks about money about women in company he believes is exclusively male. He stopped. I'm not telling you what decision to make, Miss Whitcomb. I am telling you that the picture presented in that ballroom is not the complete picture. Clara felt the air shift. She had known this. She had known it in the part of herself she'd tried to discipline into silence all season. Hearing it said aloud plainly by someone who had no obvious stake in saying it, something settled in her chest in a way that felt both like relief and like danger. "Why are you telling me?" she asked. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment, with that steady recording attention. "Because you looked like a woman who already knew and couldn't prove it. And because I am in a position to give you what you need to prove it. My father won't." "Your father is an honorable man," Nathaniel said. "Give him the truth and he'll act on it. It's the truth he's missing, not the character to receive it." Clara held very still. She thought about the letter she'd burned. She thought about October and the back staircase, and the word sensible applied to her like a category rather than a compliment. She thought about the fact that this man had watched a room with her in it, and had noticed the difference between her eyes and her smile. "You would share this information with my father directly," she said. "If you want me to, yes, ma'am. Or I can see that the documents reach him by other means, if you'd prefer a less visible path." He paused. "Either way, this isn't about me, Miss Whitcomb. This is about making sure you walk into whatever comes next with open eyes." The music behind the door swelled toward its ending. Clara knew that in approximately 4 minutes her mother would begin scanning the room for her. She knew that Samuel Whitmore would find her before the evening was over and say whatever words he believed were necessary to secure a very profitable agreement with her father before summer's end. She knew all of this. She also knew that Nathaniel Ashford was looking at her the way she'd spent 3 months telling herself he didn't. "I would like," she said carefully, "to see the documents." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the place where a smile might begin if given reason. "Then I'll see that you do." He picked up his glass. "Enjoy the remainder of your evening, Miss Whitcomb." "Mr. Ashford?" She turned back toward the ballroom door. Her hand was on the handle when his voice reached her again, quieter this time, as though he hadn't entirely planned to say it. "For what it's worth, ma'am, the decision was always going to be yours. I just didn't want you making it with incomplete information." Clara did not turn around. She pressed her hand flat against the door and breathed for one single controlled moment. Then she went back into the ballroom, found her mother accepted another glass of punch, and smiled at Samuel Whitmore when he crossed the room toward her, smiled at him with her whole face, eyes included for the first time all evening. Because she could afford to smile now. She had a plan. The evening wound on through 2 more dances and a great deal of polished conversation, and Clara moved through all of it with a steadiness that felt for the first time in months, like something she'd chosen rather than something she'd been required to perform. Whitmore was charming. He was always charming. He steered conversations with the practiced ease of a man who understood exactly what impression he needed to leave in each room on each person, at each interval of the evening. He took her hand for the final dance and leaned close enough that she could hear him clearly above the music. "Your father has agreed to receive me Tuesday," he said. It wasn't a question. It was the announcement of a foregone conclusion. "I trust that pleases you, Miss Whitcomb." "Tuesday," Clara said. "Then I'll look forward to Tuesday, Mr. Whitmore." She meant it. She absolutely meant it. Across the room, Nathaniel Ashford was putting on his coat. He didn't look at her. She didn't look at him. 2 people in a crowded room on opposite sides of a very significant Tuesday, each perfectly aware of what the other knew. Her mother found her at the coat check with an expression of barely contained satisfaction. "A fine evening," Margaret said, squeezing Clara's arm. "Mr. Whitmore seems very decided." "He does seem that way, Mama." "Your father will speak with him Tuesday." "Yes, ma'am." "Clara." Her mother stopped, turned to look at her with that searching expression she reserved for moments when she suspected Clara of harboring opinions. "Are you well? You look different." "I feel perfectly well," Clara said. And that for the first time in a long season was the complete truth. "I feel quite like myself, actually." The carriage home was quiet. Her father reviewed the evening with the air of a man satisfied with preliminary negotiations. Her mother dozed against the window before they reached the first intersection. The city moved past in blocks of torchlight and summer dark, and Clara sat with her hands folded and her spine straight, and thought about a man who'd watched a room and noticed the difference between her eyes and her mouth. She did not write a letter that night. She didn't need to. Tuesday arrived the way dreaded things always did, too quickly, and with too much sunshine. Clara came downstairs at 8:30 to find her father already in his study with the door half open, which meant he wanted to appear approachable without actually inviting interruption. Her mother was in the sitting room with her embroidery, which she hadn't touched, which meant she was listening for the sound of a carriage. Clara ate breakfast alone and said nothing to either of them. The documents had arrived Monday evening. A sealed envelope, no name on the outside, delivered by a boy who said only that a gentleman had paid him a quarter to bring it to the Whitcomb house before supper. Clara had been the one to receive it at the door. She'd taken it upstairs without mentioning it to anyone, sat at her writing desk, and read every page twice. Gambling debts. 3 of them, as Nathaniel had said. The figures were not small. There was a letter from a Philadelphia creditor addressed to Whitmore's father, measured in tone, but absolute in meaning. The debt would be called publicly, if not settled privately. There was a second document briefer from a Richmond attorney referencing the dissolution of a prior engagement and a financial arrangement made in lieu of public proceedings. There was a third page that was simply a list of names, men in Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, who had extended Whitmore credit on the strength of expected inheritances that had not materialized. Clara had read it all and then sat very still for a long time. She was not surprised. That was the thing she kept returning to quietly in the part of herself she'd spent months trying to discipline. She was not surprised. She had known something was wrong the way you know a floorboard is soft before it gives, not from evidence, just from the feel of it underfoot. What she hadn't known was what to do with that knowledge. Now she did. She slipped the envelope under her father's study door at 6 in the morning before anyone else was awake. She didn't leave a note. She didn't need to. James Whitcomb was a precise man. He would read every page, trace every name, and arrive at his own conclusions without being told what to conclude. That was the only way this would work. By 9:30, she heard him close his study door. Not slam close. The particular deliberate sound of a man putting something away before he decided what to do with it. Her mother looked up from the untouched embroidery. "James." "Not now, Margaret." Clara kept her eyes on her tea. At 11, Samuel Whitmore arrived. He came in his best coat with his best smile and the particular bearing of a man who had already composed his own success in his head before walking through the door. Clara's mother received him in the front parlor. Her father came down 3 minutes later. Clara sat in the adjoining room with a book she wasn't reading and the door open 2 inches. The first 10 minutes were pleasantries. Whitmore was fluent in pleasantries. He deployed them the way a chess player deploys pawns, not because they mattered, but because the board required them. James Whitcomb received them without warmth, which was, Clara noted, already a departure from every previous meeting. "Mr. Whitmore," her father said, and his voice had that quality she knew, flat and precise as a surveying line. "I've come across some information recently that I feel obliged to discuss before we proceed any further." A short silence. "Of course." Whitmore's tone didn't change, which told Clara he was better at concealment than she'd given him credit for. "The name Harlan Fitch in Philadelphia. Are you acquainted?" Another silence fractionally longer. "We've done business. He has a letter with your signature on it," her father said, "and a figure attached that I'd describe as significant. Would you describe it as significant, Mr. Whitmore?" The pleasantry fell out of the room like a dropped glass. Clara pressed her back against her chair and breathed very quietly. "I don't see how private financial matters. Whitmore began. "There's also a matter in Richmond," her father said. "I won't detail it. I think you know what I mean." This silence was the longest. Clara counted 7 seconds. "Mr. Whitcomb," Whitmore said, and his voice had shifted entirely, now still controlled but stripped of the charm down to something harder underneath. "I'm sure whatever you've been told the source has his own motivations for." The source, her father said, provided documentation, not testimony. "I'm not interested in motivations. I'm interested in whether the documents are accurate." No answer. "Your silence," James Whitcomb said, "is an answer, Mr. Whitmore." Clara heard the creak of a chair, her father standing. She knew that sound. "I think we will not be proceeding further. I wish you a good morning." The front door opened and closed 11 minutes after it had opened. Clara sat perfectly still and listened to her mother's sharp intake of breath in the next room, followed by a silence that had a great deal of shape to it. Her father appeared in the doorway of the adjoining room. He looked at her for a long moment, at the book open in her lap, at the door that had been open 2 inches all morning. "You knew," he said, "not an accusation, a recognition." "I suspected," Clara said. "I didn't have proof until Monday evening." "Where did it come from?" She met her father's eyes. "Someone who believed you deserved the truth." James Whitcomb looked at his daughter for another moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Something between pride and the particular pain of a man who understood he'd nearly made a serious error. Then he nodded once, in the way he nodded when something had been settled, and left the room. Her mother appeared in his place. Margaret Whitcomb's face was a study in controlled emotion relief and residual alarm, and the faintest thread of something that might eventually become gratitude. "Clara," she said. "Mama." "Who sent the documents?" "A gentleman," Clara said. "An honorable one." Margaret looked at her for a long measuring moment. Then she sat down in the chair across from Clara and picked up her embroidery. "I see," she said. She didn't ask again. The following week remade itself around the absence of Samuel Whitmore, the way a room reorders itself around removed furniture gradually, with occasional unexpected spaces where something used to be. Her mother stopped mentioning his name. Her father became, if anything, more deliberate in his attentions to her, asking her opinions at supper, including her in conversations he'd previously considered outside her province. Clara went to the Boston Athenaeum on Thursday with Eleanor Bellamy, who was 17 and sharp-minded, and asked better questions than most adults Clara knew. They were in the periodicals room when Clara heard her name said not to her from behind the far shelf. "Whitcomb girl, did you hear Whitmore was sent off Tuesday morning? 20 minutes apparently." "Who told you that?" A second voice lower. "Abigail Monroe's mother. She had it from someone in the Hargrove household. Apparently the father received some kind of documentation." "About Whitmore." "About Whitmore." A pause. "You know what I think? I think someone wanted her for himself and found a very efficient way to clear the field." Clara did not move from her chair. Eleanor looked at her with wide eyes. Clara gave the smallest shake of her head. "Who would that be?" the second voice asked. "Well." A meaningful pause. "Nathaniel Ashford was at the Hargrove ball, and he left rather suddenly, didn't he?" Clara turned a page she had not read. "That's a great deal of speculation," the second voice said. "All the best stories are—" The first replied, and footsteps moved away toward the door. Eleanor leaned forward. "Clara." "I'm reading," Clara said pleasantly. Eleanor sat back. She was sharp-minded enough not to push. But Clara saw her watching from the corner of her eye for the remainder of the afternoon with the expression of a girl assembling a picture from pieces she'd been given without permission. The problem, the particular breathtaking problem Clara had been living with since the evening in the Hargrove corridor, was that the first voice wasn't entirely wrong. She simply had the order of things inverted. Nathaniel Ashford had not sent the documents to clear the field for himself. Clara was nearly certain of that. He was not a man who operated through indirect possession. What he'd done plainly. He'd told her what he knew, offered her the means to act on it, and then stepped back. That was the thing she couldn't stop turning over. He'd stepped back. Every other man she'd known in 4 seasons of Boston society had stepped forward into her space, into her choices, into the architecture of her future. Whitmore had stepped so far forward, he'd nearly built a life inside hers before she'd fully consented to the foundation. Nathaniel Ashford had handed her something, said, "This is yours," and moved away. She didn't know what to do with that. It didn't resemble anything she'd been taught to receive. She was still turning it over 4 days later when her mother informed her with careful casualness that the Ashford family had been invited to the Bellamy Garden supper that Saturday. Clara received this information with an equivalent casualness and went upstairs to read for 2 hours without retaining a single sentence. The Bellamy Garden supper was small by Boston standards. Perhaps 40 people spread across a long yard in the gold of a late June evening, with tables set under the elms and the particular sound of a warm night coming on. Clara arrived with her parents and was immediately collected by Eleanor Bellamy, who was hosting and therefore permitted to steer guests with impunity. "He's here," Eleanor said under her breath, not looking at Clara, guiding her toward the lemonade with the focused efficiency of a girl who had in fact assembled the picture. "I don't know who you mean," Clara said. "Yes, you do." Eleanor pressed a glass into her hand. "He came with his mother, and he's been looking for someone since he arrived, and it isn't his mother." Clara drank her lemonade. Nathaniel found her or she found him, the distinction depending on which direction you were measuring, near the far end of the garden, where the elm roots had lifted the path into an uneven ridge, and most guests had instinctively avoided the far side of it. He was standing there with his coat on and a glass of something, and the look of a man who had chosen this spot deliberately. "Miss Whitcomb," he said. "Mr. Ashford." She stopped a proper distance away. "I haven't had the opportunity to thank you." "There's no debt." He said it immediately and without flourish. "You acted on your own judgment. I only provided information. You provided quite specific information at considerable risk to yourself." "Not considerable," he said. "Whitmore would rather disappear quietly than contest it. Men like that don't generally court public examination." A pause. "How is your family?" "Well," she said. "My father—" She stopped choosing her words. "My father is a man who takes his responsibilities seriously. Learning he came close to a serious misjudgment has been, I think, instructive for him." "And you?" "I never doubted my father's character," Clara said. "Only his information." Something moved in Nathaniel's expression, that almost smile again, present at the edge. "That's a generous distinction." "It's an accurate one." They stood for a moment in the elm-cool end of the garden, while the rest of the party made its noise 40 feet away. A child ran past, chasing something that had escaped from somewhere. The light was turning amber. Clara was acutely aware of the specific quality of the silence between them, the way it didn't require filling, which was either the most comfortable thing she'd experienced in years, or the most alarming. "I've been told," she said, "that there is speculation in certain quarters about your motivations in the Whitmore matter." Nathaniel looked at her steadily. "I imagine there is." "It's been suggested that you acted out of personal interest, that you intended to—" She paused. "Clear the field." He was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable, just measured the way he was measured about everything. "And what do you think, Miss Whitcomb?" She looked at him. She thought about what she knew of him. 4 meetings, 1 corridor, 1 envelope. The way he'd said, "This is not about me," and then proved it by walking away. "I think," she said, "that if you had personal interest, you would state it plainly. You're not a man who operates through indirection." "No, ma'am," he said. Quiet. "I'm not." The amber light held them both for one suspended, terrible, clarifying moment. "But I won't pretend," Nathaniel said carefully, as if the words were being placed, rather than spoken, "that I had no awareness of what it would mean if you were no longer occupied in that particular direction." Clara felt her pulse do something she elected not to examine closely. "That's a very measured way of saying something unmeasured." "I'm a measured man." A pause. Most of the time, she looked away toward the party, toward the safe noise of 40 people being social at one another. She thought about burning letters and back staircases and the difference between eyes and smiles. She thought about what it meant that he'd noticed that difference when she'd spent 3 seasons believing no one would. "My father is hosting a small dinner next Friday," she said. Her voice was admirably steady. "He's been intending to thank several people for their assistance during a recent matter. I believe your name may be on the list of those he'd like to receive." Nathaniel Ashford looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "I'd be honored to accept," he said, "if the invitation arrives." "I suspect it will," Clara said. She turned back toward the party. She walked back along the uneven path past the elm roots, toward the noise and the lemonade and Eleanor Bellamy's knowing eyes. She kept her spine straight and her hands steady and her expression exactly as pleasant and composed as a woman with nothing on her mind. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel with absolute precision the moment he looked away, the exact second the attention lifted the warmth of it, withdrawing like a hand held over a candle flame pulled back before it burns. She had 3 seconds of that awareness before Eleanor materialized at her elbow, with a fresh glass and an expression of magnificent restraint. "Well," Eleanor said. "It's a lovely evening," Clara said. Eleanor made a sound that communicated eloquently that she found this answer insufficient, but she didn't push. She was smart enough to understand that some things arrive in their own time, and smart enough to recognize from the quality of Clara Whitcomb's posture, the particular stillness in her face, the way she held her glass like something precious, that something had in fact already begun. Across the garden, Nathaniel Ashford put his glass down on a table and went to speak with his mother. He did not look toward the elm trees again. He didn't need to either. The dinner invitation arrived at the Ashford house on Monday morning, written in James Whitcomb's precise hand on good stationery. Nathaniel read it once, set it on his desk, and read it again. Then he accepted. He told himself this was courtesy. A man had wanted to express gratitude in a civilized manner, and Nathaniel had the good sense to receive it graciously. That was all this was. He repeated this to himself with the conviction of a man who knows he is lying and has decided to proceed anyway. His mother found him in the study that afternoon. Catherine Ashford was 61 years old and had spent 4 decades watching men convince themselves of things which gave her a particular fluency in the language of masculine self-deception. She picked up the Whitcomb envelope from the desk corner where he'd left it, examined the return address, and set it back down without a word. "The Whitcombs are a good family," she said. "Yes, ma'am. James Whitcomb in particular is a man of genuine principle." She paused. "His daughter has a reputation for unusual intelligence." "She does," Nathaniel said. "You've met her?" "4 times. 5 if you count the Bellamy supper." His mother looked at him with the expression she reserved for moments when she felt she had made her point adequately, and further elaboration would be beneath her. Then she left the room. Nathaniel looked at the envelope for another moment, then went back to his accounts. The Friday dinner was 8 people: the Whitcombs, Nathaniel and his mother, the Bellamy parents, and Dr. Horace Finch, who had apparently assisted James Whitcomb in verifying the Philadelphia documents through a professional contact. It was a small table and a generous meal, and the particular atmosphere of people who have collectively survived something they're too polite to name directly. James Whitcomb toasted good counsel and honest friendship without specifying either. Everyone understood. Nathaniel received the toast with a nod and the awareness of Clara 3 seats down, not looking at him, which required he was discovering nearly as much of his attention as looking at him would have. She was talking to Dr. Finch about the Athenaeum's new periodicals acquisition. She had opinions about it. Actual opinions, not the performed interest women often deployed at dinner tables to appear engaged. She disagreed with something Finch said about the selection criteria politely, but with complete firmness, and Finch laughed and said she was probably right, and she accepted that without either false modesty or excessive satisfaction. Nathaniel watched this and thought about the Hargrove corridor and the way she'd said, "You've been watching me," with surprise rather than offense. And then he thought about the fact that he was watching her again, and that he appeared to be constitutionally incapable of stopping. After supper, James Whitcomb drew him into the study. The study was a working room, maps on the wall, ledgers stacked with the precision of a man who used them, a desk that showed actual use rather than performed industry. Whitcomb poured 2 glasses of brandy and handed one to Nathaniel without asking if he wanted it. "I'll be plain," Whitcomb said. "I'd prefer it," Nathaniel said. "My daughter is not a commodity." He said it without preamble, the way a man states a fact he considers axiomatic. "She is not an arrangement or a negotiation or a sensible play. Anyone who pursues her on those terms will find me considerably less hospitable than I've been this evening." "That seems right," Nathaniel said. Whitcomb looked at him. "You understand why I'm saying this to you. I understand that you've recently had cause to be careful about men's intentions toward your daughter," Nathaniel said, "and that a man who provided useful information about her previous suitor is not automatically above scrutiny himself." "No," Whitcomb said, "he is not." A pause. "Are you above scrutiny, Mr. Ashford?" "I'd hope not." Nathaniel held the man's gaze. "I told your daughter what I knew because it was right to tell her, because she was clearly a woman who already sensed the truth and deserved the means to act on it. That was my reason, not strategy." Whitcomb was quiet for a moment, studying him with the patience of a man who had made his money reading people across negotiating tables. "And now," he said, "now I'm having brandy in your study," Nathaniel said, "and I'm telling you that I have no intention of pursuing your daughter on any terms she hasn't invited. If she decides she wants my company, I'll be there. If she doesn't, I'll conduct myself accordingly." He paused. "I reckon that's all I can honestly offer you." James Whitcomb looked at him for a long moment. Then he raised his glass. "That," he said, "is the correct answer." They finished their brandy and rejoined the party. Clara was in the hall when they came out fetching a shawl from the rack for Catherine Ashford, who had declared herself cold in the particular decisive way of women who are not accustomed to being cold but have decided to be this evening. She handed the shawl to Nathaniel's mother without looking toward the study door. But she had the particular stillness of someone who had arranged themselves into an appearance of not listening and had been listening quite intently. Nathaniel's mother accepted the shawl, patted Clara's hand, and said, "You're a thoughtful young woman," with a warmth that was entirely genuine, and also Nathaniel understood a verdict. Clara flushed slightly. "Thank you, Mrs. Ashford." "Come and visit me," his mother said. "I mean that plainly. Tuesday afternoons I'm at home. I'd enjoy the company." Clara looked startled, genuinely startled, not performed surprise. Yes, I'd like that very much." His mother smiled, settled the shawl, and moved back toward the sitting room. Nathaniel stood in the hall. Clara stood 3 feet away, still slightly flushed, looking after his mother with an expression he didn't have adequate language for yet. "She means it," Nathaniel said quietly. "She's not a woman who says things she doesn't mean." "I know," Clara said. "That makes it more—" She stopped. "More what?" She turned and looked at him directly. It was the look she'd given him in the Bellamy garden when she'd said, "You're not a man who operates through indirection," clear, fully present with something underneath it that she hadn't quite decided to name yet. "More significant," she said. They stood in the hall for 3 seconds that had the density of considerably longer. Then voices came from the sitting room. Eleanor Bellamy's mother asking after the dessert course, and the moment restructured itself into ordinary time, and Clara excused herself and walked back down the hall. Nathaniel stood where he was for a moment before following. He thought Tuesday. The weeks that followed were. Nathaniel could not find a more precise word than accumulated. Nothing dramatic happened. What happened instead was a series of ordinary occasions that collectively amounted to something he hadn't planned and couldn't dismantle. Clara came to Tuesday tea at the Ashford house. Then again, the following Tuesday. His mother, who had spent the better part of a decade expressing measured concern about his solitude, became suspiciously cheerful on Tuesday mornings. The two women talked genuinely, talked about books and city politics, and the management of a household as a practical enterprise, and Nathaniel found reasons to be home on Tuesday afternoons, which he acknowledged to himself was not subtle, and about which he elected to feel no particular shame. They began to walk. Not formally arranged, it developed the way genuine things developed between people who live in the same city and keep encountering each other with a frequency that suggests intention, even when it isn't stated as such. After Tuesday teas, Nathaniel would walk the Whitcombs' direction. Clara would fall into step beside him. They covered ground and talked about everything except what they were actually doing, which was learning each other. She was funnier than he'd expected. Not in the performed way of women who'd been taught that wit was an asset in the dry observational way of someone who found the world genuinely entertaining and didn't always bother to explain why. She said things that made him laugh before he'd fully processed them. He found this alarming and deeply inconvenient. She in turn seemed thrown by the fact that he asked follow-up questions. He'd noticed over the accumulated Tuesdays that she had a habit of offering an opinion and then pulling it slightly back, qualifying it, softening it, leaving space for the other person to disagree without having to engage with the full force of what she'd actually thought. He asked the follow-up questions anyway, into the space where the qualification lived, and she'd look at him for a half-second with something like surprise, and then say what she'd actually meant. He liked that. He liked it more than was entirely manageable. Then July arrived, and Samuel Whitmore came back. Not to the Whitcomb house. Not directly. He came back the way men like Whitmore came back, when they'd been dismissed laterally, through social channels, through the particular pressure of Boston's upper tier, which was small enough that a man with charm and persistence could re-enter the edges of it without appearing to force the door. Clara heard about it first from Eleanor Bellamy, who had it from her mother, who had been at the Harrington Charity afternoon. Whitmore had attended. He'd been gracious and measured, and had made a particular point of speaking well of the Whitcomb family publicly demonstrably, in a way that made it impossible to be accused of bearing a grudge. "He's managing his reputation," Clara told her father that evening. "I know," James Whitcomb said. He said it with the tired certainty of a man who'd been in business long enough to recognize a recalibration. "He's not coming back for you specifically. He's coming back because being sent away by the Whitcombs is a mark he needs to remove." "Can he remove it?" Her father was quiet for a moment. "If no one provides a counter-narrative, yes." Clara thought about this. She thought about all the women she knew in Boston society, the ones whose mothers were still reviewing the available names, the ones who didn't have a back staircase October moment or a well-documented envelope to rely on. She thought about Whitmore's particular gift for manufacturing warmth and the fact that it worked because it looked so entirely like the real thing. She went to see Nathaniel the next morning. Not a Tuesday, a Thursday, which meant she sent no note ahead, and arrived at the Ashford house on her own initiative for the first time. The housekeeper showed her to the front sitting room, with the expression of a woman exercising considerable professional restraint. Nathaniel came in 2 minutes later. He took in her face, which apparently communicated more than she'd intended, and said, "What happened?" "Whitmore is back in circulation," she said. "Socially, he's rebuilding." Nathaniel sat down across from her. "How far has he gotten?" "Far enough that 2 families I know of are receiving him again." She paused. "The documents you provided are specific to his dealings with my father. They don't circulate. They don't protect anyone else." He was quiet, and she knew he understood what she was saying. "There are other women," Clara said. "There will be other families. Men like Whitmore don't stop because one door closes. They find another door, and they bring the same charm and the same smile and the same arithmetic." She met Nathaniel's eyes. "I want to know if there's more. More documentation. More evidence of pattern. Something that doesn't just protect my family, but creates a record." Clara. It was the first time he'd used her given name without her title. She didn't remark on it. He didn't appear to notice he'd done it, which she found later alone, thinking about it oddly more significant than if he'd done it deliberately. "What you're asking would require approaching people who have reason not to speak. The Richmond family. The Philadelphia creditors. It would involve correspondence that couldn't be made public without risk to those families." "I know. It isn't simple." "I know that too." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to do it alone. I'm asking if it's possible." He looked at her for a long moment with that recording expression she knew now, the one that meant he was not performing consideration, but actually doing it. "It's possible," he said. "It would take time, discretion. I have both." Something settled in his face then. Not the almost smile, something quieter than that. Something she didn't yet have a name for. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She stood to leave. He stood when she did, which was courtesy, but he moved toward the door a half step before she did, which was something else. He opened it for her, and she stepped through, and they were in the hall. Her gloves in her hands. The housekeeper somewhere at the far end. The house quiet in the mid-morning way of houses that aren't expecting drama. "Thank you," Clara said. "I should be asking what you intend to do with it," he said, "when we have enough." She looked up at him. "I intend to give it to every father in Boston who deserves to know the truth before he makes a decision." Nathaniel Ashford looked at her with an expression that was not the almost smile and not the recording look, but something new, something that lived in the precise space between what a man thinks and what he's permitted himself to feel. "That," he said quietly, "is the most like you thing you've ever said." Clara felt that land somewhere in the center of her chest with a warmth that was neither comfortable nor entirely welcome because it was real in a way she wasn't sure she knew how to hold yet. "Good day, Mr. Ashford," she said. "Good day, Miss Whitcomb." A pause. "Thursday suits, apparently. If you find yourself needing to discuss the matter further." She walked down the front steps into the summer morning and did not allow herself to smile until she was around the corner and entirely out of sight. She smiled for the better part of a block. Behind her in the front hall, Nathaniel Ashford stood at the window long enough to watch her reach the corner. Then he went back to his study, sat down at his desk, and wrote the first of 3 letters, one to Philadelphia, one to Richmond, one to Baltimore, that would take 6 weeks to produce results and change the trajectory of 4 lives he hadn't yet met. He did not think about the smile. He was fairly certain she'd smiled when she turned the corner because he'd learned her well enough by now to know what her shoulders did when something satisfied her. He did not think about this. He thought about the letters. He thought about the letters for approximately 4 minutes before he stopped pretending and admitted to himself with the directness he expected from everyone else what Thursday mornings had come to mean. Then he finished the letters and sealed them and handed them to his man before he could reconsider. Some things once begun deserved to be completed. The letters came back in 6 weeks as Nathaniel had said they would. 3 envelopes, 3 cities, 3 accounts of the same man told by people who had decided finally that silence was no longer the safer choice. Philadelphia was the most detailed. Harlan Fitch had kept everything, every correspondence, every broken promise, every carefully worded extension of credit that had ultimately gone unanswered. The letter was 11 pages written in the hand of a man who had been waiting for someone to ask. He wrote without bitterness and with a precision that was more damning than outrage would have been. Whitmore had borrowed against expected inheritance twice, against a business arrangement once, and had in each instance vanished from correspondence the moment repayment became due. Fitch named 3 other men in Philadelphia who would confirm the same. Richmond was briefer. The family there, a father named Aldous Carey, wrote 4 paragraphs that said everything and named nothing publicly, but enclosed a signed affidavit that had been prepared. He explained 18 months ago, against the possibility that Whitmore appeared in another city and another family needed warning. He'd been waiting, he wrote, for someone to ask for it. Baltimore sent only a name and an address, and the words speak to this man directly. He will tell you what I cannot put in writing. Nathaniel laid all 3 on his desk and looked at them for a long time. Then he sent word to Clara. She came Thursday morning, as had become without announcement, without formal arrangement, their established pattern. She sat across from him and read every page. She read slowly, which he'd learned was not hesitation, but precision. She didn't speak while she read. When she finished, she set the last page down and was quiet for a moment. "There are more," she said. not a question. Almost certainly, he said. Aldous Carey's daughter. How old? 17 at the time, 19 now. Clara's jaw tightened slightly. Just slightly. He'd learned to read the small changes in her face, the way navigators read small changes in wind, each one telling you something significant about what was coming. And Whitmore is currently attending the Harrington Social Circle, she said. Yes. The Harringtons have a daughter. Yes. She looked at him. We need to move faster than 6 weeks. I know. He'd been thinking about this since Baltimore's letter arrived. The affidavit from Carey it's signed and witnessed. It has legal standing. If it were placed with the right people, not just shared privately, but formally registered. With whom? Clara said. Dr. Finch has a professional relationship with Judge Aldrich. Aldrich oversees civil matters in this district. A formal complaint isn't possible without Whitmore committing a crime here, but a registered record of conduct, a documented file held by the court accessible. If a complaint is ever made, that's different. Clara was quiet working through it. He could see her doing it the way her eyes moved very slightly when she was thinking something to its conclusion. That makes it permanent, she said. It means Whitmore can't simply move from city to city and start clean. That's the idea. Will Finch do it? I believe he'll do it if you ask him, Nathaniel said. She looked at him, then with a directness that still, after 6 accumulated Thursdays and 10 Tuesdays, and too many evenings to count where he'd found himself in the same room as her at social occasions that he attended with increasing transparency of motivation, managed to land differently than any other person's attention. Why me specifically? Because you're the one this affects directly. Because a young woman asking for protection for other young women carries a different moral weight than a man making the same request. He paused. And because Finch already respects your mind. I watched him defer to you at the Whitcomb dinner. He'll listen. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the Philadelphia letter and folded it precisely back into its original creases. I'll speak to Dr. Finch today, she said. She did. She arrived at Finch's surgery on Marlborough Street at noon without an appointment, which the doctor's housekeeper received with mild alarm, and which Finch himself received with the expression of a man who recognized from experience that Clara Whitcomb's unscheduled appearances indicated something that required actual attention. She laid the documents on his desk. She explained. She did not editorialize or appeal to sentiment. She presented the facts, the pattern, the existing affidavit, and her request, and then she stopped talking and let him read. Finch read for 12 minutes without speaking. Then he said, Judge Aldrich owes me a significant professional courtesy. I know, Clara said. That's why I'm here. Finch looked at her over the top of the papers. This will make you visible, Miss Whitcomb. People will know you were involved. Good, she said. He studied her for a moment. Your parents know you're here. My father knows I'm pursuing this matter. He hasn't asked for specifics which I've chosen to interpret as trust rather than oversight. A pause. I'll tell him everything this evening. Finch made a sound that was almost a laugh. All right, he said. Give me 3 days. He needed 2. On the second day, a file was registered with Judge Aldrich's court. Not a criminal complaint, not a public indictment, but a formal record of documented conduct, signed by Aldous Carey, corroborated by Harlan Fitch's notarized correspondence, and filed under Aldrich's standing order for civil conduct records. It wasn't punishment. It was a permanent paper trail that would follow Samuel Whitmore into every courthouse, every attorney's office, every formal legal proceeding for the rest of his life. Clara learned about it from Finch's note delivered Friday morning. She read it at the breakfast table and passed it to her father without comment. James Whitcomb read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at his daughter with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not pride, exactly, something more complicated than pride, something that acknowledged she had done something he hadn't known how to do himself. You managed this, he said. Several people managed it together, Clara said. Clara. She met his eyes. You managed this, he said again, firmly, as a fact. She nodded once and went back to her breakfast. That same Friday, Samuel Whitmore received a visit from a man he didn't know. A clerk from Judge Aldrich's office, who delivered a single document, a formal notice of registered civil record, with Whitmore's name on the front and the court seal at the bottom. The clerk did not explain. He did not need to. The document explained itself. Whitmore read it in the front room of his rented house on Beacon Street, and then sat very still for a long time. Then he called for his man and told him to begin packing. He was out of Boston within 10 days. The social world registered his departure the way it registered most things, with speculation analysis and the quick reordering of opinions around the new available information. Several people claimed to have always known. Several people who had received him quietly recalibrated their position. Abigail Monroe's mother said at the Harrington afternoon that she had never entirely trusted him, and had said so from the beginning, which was not accurate, but was not the sort of claim that could be easily contested. Clara heard all of this from Eleanor Bellamy, who reported social information with the accuracy and composure of a born analyst. She listened, offered no particular commentary, and went home. She was in the back sitting room that evening, writing a letter, a real one this time, to Aldous Carey's daughter in Richmond, introducing herself, expressing her hope that the younger woman was well, leaving open, without stating directly the possibility of correspondence, when her mother appeared in the doorway. Margaret Whitcomb looked at her daughter for a moment. At the letter, at Clara's face, at the particular posture of a woman who had, over the course of a summer, become someone slightly different than she'd been in June. "Nathaniel Ashford called this afternoon," her mother said. Clara kept writing. "I know. I was in the garden. I didn't hear him arrive until he'd already spoken to Father." "He spoke with your father for 40 minutes. "I know." "Clara," her mother came into the room and sat down. "He asked permission to court you properly." Clara set down her pen. She looked at her mother with an expression that was very composed, and also, she suspected, entirely transparent. "What did Father say?" "Your father said—" Her mother paused, and there was something in the pause that was soft in a way Margaret Whitcomb rarely permitted herself to be soft. "He said that was a question for you, not for him." The room was quiet for a moment. "He said that," Clara said. "He said it exactly." Margaret looked at her daughter, and in her face was something Clara recognized, the expression of a woman who had spent decades navigating a world that required her to move sideways, and had, in watching her daughter move forward, felt something both like loss and like hope. "He told Mr. Ashford that you were a woman capable of making her own determinations, and that his permission, while given freely, was secondary to yours." Clara looked down at the unfinished letter on the desk. Aldous Carey's daughter, 19 years old, in Richmond, who had been alone with the wrong knowledge for 2 years before anyone thought to ask. Her own father, who had nearly made a serious error and had corrected it with the kind of integrity that didn't require applause. Nathaniel Ashford, who had said from the beginning that the decision was always going to be hers. She thought the people worth having are the ones who give you the choice. "Where is Mr. Ashford now?" she asked. "Your father invited him to stay for supper," her mother said. "He's in the study." Clara looked at the letter. She folded it carefully, addressed it, and set it aside to be sealed in the morning. Then she stood, smoothed her dress, and walked down the hall toward the study. She knocked once. "Come in," her father said. She opened the door. James Whitcomb was at his desk. Nathaniel Ashford was standing near the window, not performing casualness, not arranging himself into ease, just standing there in the way he stood, present and unhurried, and exactly as he was. He looked at her when she came in. Not the recording look, not the almost smile. Something that had moved past both of those into something she didn't have a word for yet, though she thought she might eventually, if given sufficient time. "Father," she said, "would you give us a few minutes?" James Whitcomb rose from his desk with the carefully neutral expression of a man exercising significant discipline. "I'll see to the supper arrangements," he said, and left, closing the door with a restraint that Clara recognized as love. The study was quiet. Summer light through the window. The same room where her father had sent Whitmore away in May, which felt like a different year now, a different city, a different woman standing in it. "You spoke to my father," she said. "I did." Nathaniel didn't move from the window. He was giving her the space to come to him or not, which was she had come to understand simply how he was. He gave space because he knew what it meant to need it. "I should have spoken to you first. I know that. I did it backward." "Why?" she asked. "Why my father first?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I wanted him to know my intentions were serious before I said anything to you. Because if you said no, I didn't want you to feel any social pressure from your family's expectations." He paused. "I wanted whatever you decided to be free." Clara looked at him. She thought about burned letters and back staircases and the particular sensation of being seen accurately. She thought about a man who'd watched a room and noticed the difference between her eyes and her smile, and had not used that knowledge as leverage not once, not in any of the weeks and Thursdays and accumulated moments that had brought them here. "Nathaniel," she said. It was the first time she'd used it, his name plainly without the title that kept people at the correct social distance. Something moved in his face. "Clara?" "I've been in love with you," she said, "since approximately the 3rd Tuesday of June. I want you to know that I'm aware of how that sounds, and I've decided not to be embarrassed about it." He was across the room in 4 steps, which was the least measured thing she'd ever seen him do, and that alone told her everything she needed to know about whether the feeling was mutual. He stopped just short of her still himself, still that careful stillness, but his eyes were doing something entirely different than recording now. "I wrote a letter in April," he said, "after the Harrington dinner. I've never sent it." "What did it say?" "It said—" He stopped, then quieter. "It said that I'd met a woman who saw things clearly and acted on what she saw and didn't require rescue but deserved, if she wanted it, the particular company of someone who recognized what she was." Clara felt the warmth in her chest from the Bellamy Garden return, except now it had somewhere to go. "Did it mention," she said, "that she'd been watching you across 4 social gatherings and had burned a letter of her own?" "It did not," Nathaniel said. "That information would have been useful earlier." "I reckon it would have." She smiled, not the careful, composed smile she'd spent 4 seasons deploying in ballrooms, but the real one, the one Eleanor had been trying to read all summer. "We've been remarkably inefficient about this." He smiled back, fully for the first time without the almost. It changed his face entirely. She decided she intended to see it regularly. "We have," he said. He took her hand. She let him. His grip was careful and certain all at once, the way everything about him was as though he'd made a decision and intended to stand by it. "I would like," he said, "to court you properly, with your father's knowledge, which I already have, and with yours." "You have mine," Clara said. Down the hall in the direction of the kitchen, James Whitcomb told his wife to set 2 extra places for supper, though only 1 extra guest had been planned, and Margaret Whitcomb looked at him for a moment, and then set them without asking why. She didn't need to ask. She already knew. Supper that evening was the kind of meal that people remember not for the food, but for what moved underneath the conversation, the particular warmth of a table where something has been resolved and everyone present knows it, but no one says it directly because saying it directly would diminish it somehow. James Whitcomb carved the roast with unusual generosity. Margaret asked Nathaniel questions about his family's shipping interests, with the focused attention she reserved for things she intended to understand completely. Nathaniel answered without performance, which Clara had come to recognize as his highest form of respect. He didn't arrange himself for people he valued. He simply arrived as he was, and trusted that to be sufficient. Eleanor Bellamy would have found the whole thing unbearably satisfying. Clara found it unbearably real, which was better. After supper, when Nathaniel had gone and her parents had retired, and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Clara sat at her writing desk and finished the letter to Aldous Carey's daughter in Richmond. She sealed it. Then she started a second letter, shorter, to a woman named Mrs. Prudence Hale, who ran the women's reading circle at the Athenaeum, and had mentioned at 3 separate occasions that she wished someone would organize a means by which families could inquire into a suitor's reputation before formal courtship proceedings began. Clara had been thinking about that wish all summer. She had something now that made it actionable. She wrote for an hour. When she was done, she had 2 sealed letters and the beginning of a third, and the particular tiredness that comes not from depletion, but from having used yourself fully. She went to bed and slept without difficulty for the first time in months. The formal courtship began the following week and proceeded with the measured deliberateness that characterized everything Nathaniel Ashford did. He called Tuesday and Thursday. He took her walking on Saturdays when the weather permitted. He met her at the Athenaeum twice, which required no arrangement, because they had both developed independently the habit of being there on Wednesday mornings, a coincidence so regular that the periodical's librarian had begun setting aside publications she thought might interest either of them. Clara told him about the letters, about Mrs. Hale and the reading circle, and the idea she'd been assembling across the summer. Not charity, not a reform society, nothing with that particular quality of condescension that made women feel managed rather than helped. Something practical. A network. A means by which a young woman or her family could make discreet inquiry into the actual history of a man presenting himself as a suitable match before any formal steps were taken. She told him on a Thursday in his mother's sitting room, with Catherine Ashford, conspicuously absent on the pretext of needing something from the kitchen. Nathaniel listened to all of it without interruption, which she'd learned was not passivity, but the active attention of someone who intended to understand before he responded. When she finished, he said, "You'll need a legal structure. I know. Not just Dr. Finch. Someone with standing to receive formal inquiries. A trustee, or, my father has agreed to serve in that capacity," Clara said. He suggested it himself. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. "When did you speak to him?" "Monday morning." She paused. "I had the outline by Sunday." Something moved in his face, not surprise exactly. More like the recognition of something he'd already suspected confirming itself. "You've been building this since July," he said. "Since October," Clara said. "Since the back staircase at the Henderson dinner. I didn't have the means until this summer. Now I do." He was quiet for a moment. She had learned by now not to fill his silences. They were not empty. They were occupied, and interrupting them was like interrupting a man mid-sentence. "I want to help," he said. "Not manage it. Help. There's a difference." "I know the difference," Clara said. "That's why I'm telling you." He nodded once with the particular decisiveness she associated with him when he'd made a real determination. "Then tell me what you need." What she needed, it turned out, was his name, not his money. She had a practical plan that didn't require significant funding in its early form. Not his connections, though those would matter later. What she needed specifically was the weight that a man's formal endorsement carried in Boston society in 1818, which was an injustice she was clear-eyed about and had decided to use rather than resent. Nathaniel Ashford's name on a letter of introduction opened doors that Clara Whitcomb's name alone would have required 6 months of social work to reach. He gave it without hesitation and without making her feel small for asking. Mrs. Prudence Hale received them together in her front parlor on a Wednesday afternoon in late August and listened to Clara's proposal with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this particular conversation for approximately 15 years. By the end of the hour, she had agreed to host the first organizational meeting at the Athenaeum Reading Room, had suggested 4 other women who should be present, and had told Nathaniel with brisk cordiality that he was welcome to attend in a supporting capacity, but that the actual direction of the enterprise belonged to Miss Whitcomb. "Obviously," Nathaniel said. Mrs. Hale looked at him for a moment, then at Clara, then back at him. "You'll do," she said, which was, Clara understood, the highest possible endorsement from that quarter. The first meeting was 12 women. The second was 20. By the third, held in the first week of September, there were 28, and a woman named Mrs. Frances Aldridge had arrived with her own documentation. A different man, a different city, a pattern so familiar by now that every person in the room recognized it immediately. Clara stood at the front of the room and listened to Frances Aldridge speak, and felt something she had no precedent for, the particular sensation of a private conviction becoming a shared one, of something she'd carried alone for a year, being held collectively and found in that collective holding to have been worth carrying. She looked at Nathaniel at the back of the room. He was looking at her. She looked away first because she had a meeting to run. Then came the afternoon that changed everything again. It was a Tuesday in mid-September, 4 days before the Hargrove Autumn Gathering, which was the social event marking Boston's transition from summer season to fall. Clara was at the Ashford house for tea, as had become unremarkable to everyone, including the housekeeper, who no longer affected surprise at her arrival. Catherine Ashford was in a particular mood, not agitated, but holding something carefully, the way people hold information they're uncertain how to deliver. She poured tea and talked about the garden, and then without transition said, "I received a letter from an old acquaintance in Baltimore this morning." Clara set down her cup. Something in Catherine's voice put her on alert. "Her name is Mrs. Charlotte Webb," Catherine said. "Her daughter was engaged to Samuel Whitmore 3 years ago." The engagement was broken by Whitmore, not the family under circumstances that Mrs. Webb describes as... She paused, choosing. "Damaging." "Damaging how?" Clara asked. He spread word in Baltimore that the engagement had been broken at his initiative due to concerns about the family's financial stability. Catherine's voice was precise and very quiet. "The Webbs are a solid family, not wealthy but solid. What he said effectively narrowed the daughter's prospects for 2 years. She's only recently begun to recover socially." Clara felt the cold clarity she'd felt reading the Philadelphia documents in May, that particular sensation of a pattern completing itself. "He punished them for knowing too much," she said. "That appears to be what happened," Catherine said. "And now," Clara said. "Why is Mrs. Webb writing now?" "Because she heard through a chain of connection I won't bore you with about the registered file with Judge Aldrich." Catherine looked at her directly. "She wants to add her testimony. She has the daughter's written account. She wants to know if someone will receive it." The room was very quiet. "Yes," Clara said. "Someone will." Nathaniel had come in during the last part of this. She heard him in the doorway without turning. "Baltimore," he said. "Baltimore," Clara said. "Your original letter." "The man I told you to speak to directly," he said. He came fully into the room and sat down. "I should have pushed harder on that contact in August." "We have it now," Clara said. "The Hargrove gathering is Thursday," he said. "Whitmore won't be there, he's been gone 2 months. But there are people there who need to know that the Aldrich file is open, that it accepts additional testimony, that there is a formal mechanism now for exactly this kind of record." He paused. "Would you be willing to speak about it, not formally, socially, in the way information actually travels in this city?" Clara looked at him. She thought about June, about pressing her back against the wall and reading a letter she'd never send, and telling herself firmly that she did not think about Nathaniel Ashford. She thought about how small that woman seemed now, not because she'd been weak, but because she'd been alone with things too large for one person to carry quietly. "I'll speak about it," she said. "Gladly." The Hargrove Autumn Gathering arrived with the brisk certainty of New England September, and Clara attended it with a different quality of presence than she'd brought to the summer ball 4 months earlier. She moved through the room with the ease of someone who had nothing to perform and nothing to conceal. She spoke to the women she needed to speak to. She mentioned the Athenaeum Circle. She said to 3 separate mothers in 3 separate corners of the evening that if they ever had questions about a gentleman's history, there were now people in Boston with the means and the discretion to help them find answers. Each time she watched the women's faces. Each time she saw the same thing, relief moving in behind the careful social composure, the particular relief of someone who had suspected they were alone with a problem and has just learned they aren't. Nathaniel stayed mostly to the other side of the room and let her work. Once passing her in the hall between the parlor and the dining room, he said quietly, "You're very good at this." "I've had practice navigating rooms," she said. "That's not what I mean." He stopped just briefly in the way he stopped when he had something real to say. "I mean, you make people feel safe enough to tell the truth. That's not a common thing." She looked at him for a moment in the hall's candlelight with the noise of the party on both sides of them. She thought, "I will remember this." This exact moment. The way it feels to be seen accurately by someone who has no reason to see you inaccurately. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and moved on. The evening ended well. Walking home with her parents, Nathaniel had his own carriage. They'd parted at the Hargrove steps with a formality that deceived no one present. Clara heard her mother say to her father, in the quiet voice Margaret reserved for things she meant completely, "She's going to be fine, James." Her father made the sound he made when he agreed with something, but found it insufficient. "She's going to be more than fine," he said. Clara, walking between them in the September dark, said nothing. She didn't need to add anything to that. The engagement was announced at the Whitcomb autumn dinner in October. Not because it was required to be announced at a dinner. Nothing required it to be done in any particular way. But because James Whitcomb wanted to do it at his own table with the people he trusted present in a room where the summer's events had played out and been resolved. He felt he told his wife that it was right to close something in the same place it opened. Margaret agreed and ordered the good china. Nathaniel arrived with his mother and with the particular bearing of a man who has decided something fully and has no ambivalence left about it. Clara met him in the hall before supper, and they stood together for one moment privately before the dinner began. "Are you ready?" he asked. She looked at him. At the man who had told her the truth when truth was the most useful thing she could have received. Who had given her information and then moved back and let her act. Who had endorsed her work with his name and attended her meetings from the back of the room and told her she made people feel safe enough to tell the truth. She thought about the letter she'd burned in June. She thought, "I could write it now and actually send it. I've been ready since October," she said. "The October before last." He laughed fully genuinely, and she took his arm and they walked into supper. In the weeks that followed the engagement announcement, the Athenaeum Circle met for the 5th time and established a formal charter. Clara wrote the charter language herself with Dr. Finch, reviewing the legal portions, and her father reviewing the practical ones. It established a documented record-keeping system, a process for receiving testimony, a means of formal inquiry, and at Mrs. Hale's insistence, a small lending library of practical guides for young women navigating courtship inheritance and their legal rights as citizens of the Republic. Mrs. Charlotte Webb came from Baltimore in November and met with Clara for 2 hours in the Athenaeum reading room. She was 53, direct with the particular manner of a woman who had done her grieving privately, and arrived at something harder and more useful on the other side. She added her testimony to the Aldrich file and agreed to serve as the Baltimore correspondent for the Circle's network. When she left, she pressed Clara's hands and said, "I wish someone had done this for my daughter 3 years ago." "Someone will do it for the next one," Clara said. "Because of you," Mrs. Webb said. "Because of a great many people," Clara said. "I was simply the one who started." She told Nathaniel about the meeting that Thursday. He listened and then said, "You said you were the one who started. You reckon that's accurate?" She thought about it honestly. "The back staircase in October," she said. "That's when I started. All you did was give me the proof." "And the Thursday visits," he said. "And the Thursday visits," she allowed. "And the letters to Philadelphia, Richmond, and Baltimore." "You did contribute the letters," she said. "And the name on the charter." "Nathaniel, I'm just noting," he said, "that your definition of 'I simply started' is doing considerable work." She looked at him and thought not for the first time that she intended to spend a very long time being argued with by this man, and found the prospect entirely agreeable. "Fine," she said. "We started. That's all I wanted," he said. They were married the following April, when Boston had begun the particular slow green arrival of spring, and the ceremony was small and deliberate, exactly as they both wanted it attended by the people who had been present for the events that made it possible. Dr. Finch, Eleanor Bellamy, Mrs. Prudence Hale, James and Margaret Whitcomb, who sat in the front and held hands which they had not done in public since their own wedding 23 years prior. After walking out into the April morning, Clara thought about all the letters she'd written alone in the dark, and the one she hadn't needed to write, because the feeling it contained had found at last the person it was meant for. She took her husband's arm. Nathaniel Ashford had ridden into a summer party not knowing he was riding toward anything. He had told the truth to a woman in a hallway, not knowing what the truth would set in motion. He had stepped back when every instinct of the world around him said step forward, and in stepping back, had given her the room to become fully and without obstruction exactly who she was. And Clara Whitcomb had burned a letter and built something real instead, something that outlasted the season. That began it, something that reached from Boston to Richmond to Baltimore and would reach further still. Something that bore both their names and neither of their names, and belonged finally to all the women who would come after and find that someone had already done the work of making their path safer. That was who they were. That was what they chose. And that was enough, more than enough, to last a lifetime.